Jesus answered, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me.
Thank you, Ava and Mary. This is a kind of a reflection on a certain kind of thread in my life, and probably, if you were to think about it, you could identify little stories and maybe even a pattern or thread in your life, and it's on the theme of weird coincidences, supernatural events, and funny feelings. Is that you, God? Is that you, God? And this is actually one of my favorite kind of ways of helping people think about their own lives and whether God has already been present in them even before they have come to Jesus. Even before they say, Jesus, I commit to you. Because those kinds of things happened to me before I came to Jesus. And I think a lot of us have probably experienced something subtle or strange and small, or maybe big, that we couldn't really explain. So let me tell you one of my experiences. It happened to me when I was 16 years old. I had been body surfing at the beach, Huntington Beach in Southern California, to be exact. And I was overwhelmed that the ocean was going to swallow me up. Now, I want to say that I was a competitive swimmer for 8 years by that point. I was the captain of my high school varsity water polo team and swim team. And I tell you that just to say I had no fear of water, right? I'm not boasting about, but I had no fear of water, no fear of drowning. In fact, I had hopes of getting a swimming or a water polo scholarship to college. But my friends and I were at the beach like we would do during the summers, like once or twice a week. And we even swam around the Huntington Beach Pier, which extended about 400 yards into the ocean. And we had seen like dolphin fins and things like that. So it's just lots of stuff. You know, I was pretty experienced at that place. But this particular day, I was walking on top of the pier eating my burrito. And I stopped to watch some fishermen, like dangling their threads, their poles over the pier, and I looked at the ocean, and it was as if I was seeing it for the first time. And I was struck by how big and how powerful it was. I felt really small all of a sudden, and I started shivering. This was a summer day in LA, y'all, and I was shivering cold. And it was as though, I mean, it's hard to describe, but I heard a voice say very quietly but very powerfully, "You see, Mako? There is someone greater than you." I know, it was a real check. And like, I started backing up, like on the pier, like, I'm sure people looking at me were like, what is that boy doing? I thought, what was that? Where did that thought come from? And mind you, I didn't believe in God at that point in my life. But everything I thought about, you know, like all the questions and evolution, like all the questions that I had, didn't stop me from thinking from that point about like, maybe there is someone much greater than I am, and maybe I should try to find out who that is. So, but I, you know, like probably most 16-year-olds at that point, I pushed the thought back into my mind and I went on eating my burrito and the moment closed. But, you know, like it was as if curtains opened and then curtains closed, and then I was like, that was weird, and I went on my way. Now, what was that? Right? What was that? Was it God? Now bear with me for a moment, because other people have had those kinds of experiences. And again, probably you have too. So in a moment, after I share, I would love for you to share with a neighbor and talk about some of these things because we don't often get a chance to talk about those experiences. They're just weird. How easy is it to go up to someone and say, I want to tell you about this weird thing that happened? Like we just don't have many contexts like that, but this has got to be one of them. As an example, Curt Schilling, the pitcher for the Red Sox during the 2004 World Series, right, where the Red Sox kind of miraculously won the World Series after like decades and decades. He had some of those experiences. Like his heel was bleeding. You'll remember that because he had like sutures that were cut, like stitches that were coming loose, and so his socks were actually blood red. And then they won. Right, and then he was interviewed afterwards, and he said this. I want to get the quote right. The most important thing was, I don't know, like all the things that happened. It felt like God, and people were like, well, what do you have to say about it? And he said, I don't know. I just wish everyone had a chance to have a day like I did. Right? And for me, as an Asian American, when Jeremy Lin was playing in the NBA and had that amazing run of games, like early in his career, he said in an interview, there were times I was playing in the D League when I didn't know how I did that. It felt like someone was guiding me. I just felt like God was controlling me out there. Let me tell you a story of a woman named Martha who lives right here in Boston. She and her husband were both educated at Harvard. They got doctorates from Harvard. Husband John studied economics. Martha studied sociology. They learned that their son Adam would be born with mental handicaps. Their lives took a very dramatic turn, not just because they now had a special needs child, but because they had to slow their lives down. Slow it down enough to listen to other things happening in their lives, a spiritual side of things. And they started to experience these really weird events. Here's one of them. Before Martha knew that she was pregnant, but they had conceived their son Adam, they were driving on a road in New Hampshire and they lost control of their car. So they spun around 4 times into the oncoming traffic. They did not get hit, and instead they gently pulled onto the side of the road. So Martha writes this in the book that she wrote afterwards. The odd thing is that I never had any doubt we were completely safe. I remember being mildly concerned that the spinning motion might make Katie, their daughter, who was sitting in the back in a car seat, car sick, right? I turned around to look at her, strapped into the car seat behind me, but I was pinned against my own seat by a centrifugal force stronger than anything I'd ever felt. I couldn't even move my head, so I just relaxed and watched the leaves go by. And then when their car stopped, 2 men rushed over to make sure that they were okay. One of them had severe mental handicaps, if that were obvious. He looked straight at Martha, who was pregnant with Adam, who would be born with severe mental handicaps, but she did not know that she was pregnant. And this man said to her, "He's a good boy, ma'am. You take good care of that baby." Okay. And her book is called Expecting Adam. It was a national bestseller when it was released. Why was it that, only when their son Adam was born was she like, okay, the car was out of control, but I was calm. That's weird thing number 1. Then this man with severe mental handicap says to me about my son, who I didn't even know I was carrying, who would have severe mental handicaps. He's a good boy. Like, that's really weird. And the book goes on and on about all of these weird experiences that they began to notice because their lives they had to slow down their lives. Is it coincidence? So I don't think so. There are just too many similarities across multiple people, across multiple cultures, and I don't think it's just me. And I don't think it's just the human mind looking for patterns. Although, sure, I mean, we do that. But I think there's something that happens when, like, we realize something about our place in the natural world and its beauty, and there's beauty and goodness in us as well. And sure, things like that happen where some kind of curtain opens up, but it's not just that, oh, that was a nice experience. Something deeper happens. Is it God? Right? And, one of the many tests that we could do is start praying and see how God responds. And, I have my own kind of list. You probably have a list of ways that you felt like, okay, I prayed and maybe God responded, or maybe it wasn't even what I prayed for, but I know that God responded. Right? I got some kind of response. And again, what I'm trying to describe here is not like prayer is magical or that things are formulaic. I do feel like God has answered prayers in my life, but not always in the way I expected. But there is kind of this element of mystery, usually. Like, I don't know exactly how to explain that. And here's also a disclaimer. I'm not saying that God just causes everything, right? I mean, I think God upholds all life, upholds all things, but everything has its appropriate freedom. And so I'm not saying that God causes evil, especially. He doesn't cause everything, but there's this thread of things of experiences that we have. Weird coincidences, funny feelings, supernatural events where it feels like we walk into a thin spot, right? A thin spot is where the boundary between heaven and earth gets thin, right? And it's like curtains part. Yes. And we see something, or we hear something, or we sense something in a way where it's like, and then it closes. Ultimately, we have to get into really serious questions here. Like, does God want to stay hidden? I don't think so. I think if we grant any of these events as being real, God must want to reveal something about himself. Like he wants an ongoing relationship with us. The deepest possible relationship that we can possibly have, which brings me right to Jesus. Because in Jesus, the divine nature and the human nature come together in the deepest possible relationship that we can ever imagine. And somehow, Jesus himself is the thin spot, right? Like he is the join between heaven and earth. He is the place where curtains open. And I want to give you a few examples of that. Like many folks in mostly Muslim countries have reported having dreams where Jesus shows up. But it happens in the U.S. too. Anne Lamott is an author who lives also in California. I read her, because I was living in California at the time. And she has a very touching book called Traveling Mercies where she describes an encounter with Jesus. I'm going to read you about a page worth. I didn't go to the flea market the week of my abortion. I stayed home, smoked dope, and got drunk. Tried to write a little, and went for slow walks along the salt marsh with Pammy. On the 7th night, though, very drunk and just about to take a sleeping pill, I discovered she was having some kind of medical problem, which I won't get into. I thought maybe I should call a doctor, but I was so disgusted that I had gotten so drunk 1 week after an abortion that I just couldn't wake up and ask for help. I got in bed, shaky and sad and too wild to have another drink or take a sleeping pill. I had a cigarette and turned off the light. Please don't do that. I just want to say. After a while, as I lay there, I became aware of someone with me. hunkered down in the corner. And I just assumed it was my father, whose presence I had felt over the years when I was frightened and alone. Her father had passed away, and she felt the presence of her father at a certain point. The feeling was so strong that I actually turned on the light for a moment to make sure no one was there. Of course, there wasn't. But after a while, in the dark again, I knew beyond any doubt that it was Jesus. I felt him as surely as I feel my dog lying nearby as I write this. And I was appalled. Appalled. I thought about my life and my brilliant, hilarious, progressive friends. I thought about what everyone would think of me if I became a Christian. And it seemed an utterly impossible thing that simply could not be allowed to happen. I turned to the wall and said out loud, I would rather die. I felt him just sitting there on his haunches in the corner of my sleeping loft, watching me with patience and love. And I squinched my eyes shut. But that didn't help, because that's not what I was seeing him with. Finally, I fell asleep, and in the morning, he was gone. This experience spooked me badly, but I thought it was just an apparition, born of fear and self-loathing and booze and loss of blood. But then everywhere I went, I had the feeling that a little cat was following me, wanting me to reach down and pick it up, wanting me to open the door and let it in. But I knew what would happen. You let a cat in one time, give it a little milk, and then it stays forever. So I tried to keep one step ahead of it, slamming my houseboat door when I entered or left. 1 week later, when I went back to church, I was so hungover that I couldn't stand up for the songs, and this time I stayed for the sermon, which I just thought was ridiculous. Like someone trying to convince me of the existence of extraterrestrials, but the last song was so deep and raw and pure that I could not escape. It was as if the people were singing in between the notes, weeping and joyful at the same time, and I felt like their voices or something was rocking me in its bosom, holding me like a scared kid, and I opened up to that feeling, and it washed over me. I began to cry and left before the benediction, and I raced home and felt the little cat running at my heels, and I walked down the dock past dozens of potted flowers under a sky as blue as one of God's own dreams. And I opened the door to my houseboat, and I stood there a minute, and then I hung my head and said, forget it. Actually, she used a different F word. Forget it. I quit. I took a long, deep breath and said out loud, all right, you can come in. So this was my beautiful moment of conversion. Some of us have experienced that feeling that there's a little cat running along our feet, chasing our heels. Jesus leaves small hints of himself, just a trace. And why Jesus? Because as we heard in these scriptures where Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the place where God and humanity become one. It's because in other belief systems, human beings locate evil somewhere outside of them. But in the Bible, in the Old Testament, Jesus and the New Testament writers locate evil in human nature. We were created good, but we did things to damage ourselves. And now our problems are not simply the result of things out there, but things in here. And so, there are important things out there which we still must fight and resist and temper. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we just focus internally. But we start internally, and we include things that are internal to us. And so Jesus said, I am healing human nature from within as one of you, because God has always loved you and wanted your partnership to heal your human nature. But like any doctor with a patient, the doctor needs your partnership. You need to participate fully in the healing process. And here's the thing. I know when we read the scripture, kind of something goes up in our minds, in the back of our neck, when we hear like, no one comes to the Father but through me. Yeah, that is challenging. But it's because unless we look at Jesus and see God in and through Jesus, then what do we do with the problem of evil, especially human evil? Well, it must be somewhere, right? It must come from, but unless we see a God who is loving and healing the evil out of us, then we will conclude the universe also is evil, or that God is at least partly evil. And do you really want to know or get to know a God like that? Do you really want to love a God like that? Do you want to follow a God like that? No. The only God who is 100% good, who loves us all the way down, has nothing to hide about himself, is the God who came in Jesus to heal human nature in his own body. Every other way to God will give you a God who is at least partly evil and deeply scary. And so if God is going to want a deep relationship with you and me, with all humanity, then it makes sense to start with Jesus. Because Jesus exemplifies it. Jesus heals it. Jesus undergirds it. When I gave my life to Jesus, nothing spectacular happened. Actually, it felt a little bit to me like I was dying in a sense, like it was humbling. This was late in high school, and I felt like by coming to Jesus, I was admitting that I could not run my own life. And that's why it felt like kind of dying, right? Like my ego was dying. But slowly, I started having experiences of him giving me his life. The most powerful instance of this was I still think it's one of the most powerful. It was during the summer after my junior year of college. That was the time my parents finally decided to get a divorce. My dad's drinking had escalated to this really alarming place. He was spending a lot of money. And my way of and my mom had it. And rightfully so. Now, my way of dealing with my family ever since 10th grade was to leave because I got my driver's license. I was in a rush, y'all. I was not like many of the Boston kids who were like, driver's license. I was like, give me my driver's license. I want out of here. So I'd go to a park, or I would go to my friend's place to play video games, or I would go to swimming practice or work out. And I just left. I did not want to deal with the mess at home. But that summer, during college, before my senior year, I felt like Jesus said to me, I want you to stay at home as much as possible. I said, no. I do not have the strength to do that. I don't have the love to do that. So, look, if you want me to do that, you're going to have to give me the strength and love. And I don't know how else to say it, but he did. He did. So my parents couldn't afford a lawyer, so they sat down and they said, Mako, we want you to sit with us and arbitrate like who gets what. And I tell you, I have never felt more like used, overlooked, like my feelings didn't matter, like I don't have opinions about this. And I remember saying to Jesus going into that, I cannot do this. And he said, I'm with you. I love you. And as I listened to each of my parents, I remember thinking, I've heard them say this before. All these things, I've heard them say this before. These fights are not new. But somehow I'm hearing more of them in what they're saying than I ever have before. I hear them with new love that is not mine. We finished in less than 2 hours. And later I was telling a friend of mine from high school what had just happened. And I was like, I don't know. I even used to have opinions, strong opinions, more for my sake than my parents, right? Like when that happens, because a few years before I was like, Mom and Dad, you need to get a divorce. First I was like, you need to stay together. But it was for my sake. And then, a year before this summer, this challenging summer, I said, Mom and Dad, you need to get a divorce. But it was for my sake. As I sat there, I genuinely was like, I really don't know. I don't know. I mean, all I know is I'm convicted that Jesus loves each of you, and you're the ones that are going to have to deal with each other one way or the other. So, but I'll love you through it. And so I was telling my friend from high school, and I was just saying, I've never been this kind of person before. And he said words that I will always treasure. He said, Mako, how could you be so other-centered at a time like this? And I said, only Jesus. Only Jesus. That's the critical shift, right? And I want you to know this and to listen for it in others. It's not so much that things happened to me or just kept happening to me, but that things started happening through me. And in me, I experienced Jesus pouring out his life and love through me. And I had a very different level of understanding or certainty about it. Jesus had me experience God, a loving God who wants partnership from others in a totally different level than before. And so, not from this vague and shadowy distance, but from the way that Jesus himself looked at God the Father in the Spirit and said, it's perfectly clear. I see you. I see your love. I see your goodness. This is what is happening in and through me as I share the love of the Father through me. And that is how I make sense of this scripture that Ava and Mary read. No one comes to the Father but through me. No one gets to a loving God but through Jesus. Every other attempt, every other location, every other position will just lead you to conclude that there is a very strange, partly evil God out there, and who knows what kind of character that God has. And that's why we sing songs like, you are not a God created by human hands, and so forth. The negations, the clarification is just as important as what we are affirming about Jesus' experience of God and how he shares that with us. So along those lines, there's one more incident that summer that I want to mention. There was one night, it was a weeknight, that I went to bed around 10:30 p.m. I was exhausted, and normally I sleep like a rock, or I did back then. Now that I've become a parent, man, those days are over. But during the night, I woke up. Would anyone mind getting me a tissue? Thank you, Tisha. My nose is running. But during the night, oh, thanks so much, Alice. I forgive you. But during the night, I just woke up suddenly for no reason. There was I didn't hear a sound, but I looked over at my digital clock and it said 1:18 a.m. I decided to get out of, oh, thank you. Look, thank you very much. So I was wide awake and I decided to go downstairs. And I saw a little light under the door that goes to the garage. I was like, that's weird. So I opened the door and I discovered my mom in the car with the garage door closed, having started the car. She was about to die by suicide, or seemed to have intended to. So I went in and discovered her there. I turned off the car right away and kind of talked her down and talked her back into the house. Who woke me up? I think it was Jesus. I have no other explanation, really. And I certainly don't have any better way to interpret that. How would you interpret that? I think it was Jesus. Now again, it's hard to think through then all of life, or try to piece together. Okay, but there are some times when it seems like God doesn't intervene, or God doesn't wake someone up, and, right? I mean, we know about that. So what do we do? But there's still this thread of experiences where God seems to show up in thin spots, in moments when the boundary between heaven and earth seems thinner than usual. And I want to share, again, one more story. So my dad is not a believer. He has always wrestled with things like this. But within the space of 2 Saturdays, my dad experienced something really amazing. So one of those Saturdays was May 15th, 1999. It was the day that Ming and I got married. We were out here in Boston, and, on that day, I entered into a new life joined with another. And Ming and I had prayed about, God, Lord Jesus, use our wedding to communicate something about your love and reveal something about you. So, the symbolism, the joy, all of that. Please communicate you through all this. All right, so my family and friends flew out from California to be here. My dad and my mom came separately because by that time they were divorced. And it was a busy weekend. I didn't really get a chance to talk to any individual person. So, my dad flew back to California. And the next Saturday, May 22nd, he went to a funeral. The funeral was for a former supervisor of his at his work. That gentleman was also Japanese American. That guy, my dad did not know it before, but that guy, his first name was Makoto, or his Japanese name was Makoto, which is my first name. Mako is short for Makoto. And also, my dad did not know that this gentleman believed in Jesus. And so this was a Christian funeral. So my dad walked into the funeral service and noticed all these things, like, that guy shared my son's name. It's Makoto. And he looked at the date that this guy died. It was May 15th, 1999. And then, the minister gets up and starts eulogizing, this gentleman. And the scripture was John 14, verse 6. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Because you know what Makoto means in Japanese? Truth. And so it's literally, I am the way, the Makoto, and the life. And my dad started shivering like he was freezing cold in a normal room. And he sat down, and listened to all this. by the time we walked out, he was sweating. So I caught up with my dad maybe a few days after that because, Ming and I got back from the honeymoon and all this. But he and I talked, and he told me about the funeral. And he said, I feel like there was a message for me in there somehow. And I said, yeah, I think so. I think so. I think, Dad, that you actually saw a picture of my spiritual journey. Because, when I came to Jesus, we understand that it is a joining of two lives. It's like a marriage, right? Like I became joined to Jesus spiritually. So marriages represent two becoming one. Like that, you saw that at my wedding. You were there. And then you also experienced or saw a death. And Christians also describe our coming to Jesus moment as a dying and rising. Right? It's dying to an old life and rising to a new life, joined with Jesus, joined with another. And somehow, May 15th, 1999, is when you encountered, in different ways, a Makoto who both died and a Makoto who rose to new life joined with another. That's why I think you saw my spiritual journey playing out right in front of you. It was like, I'll think about that. And that, again, is why Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. Now, I'm willing to bet that some of you, maybe all of you, have had some experience of a weird coincidence, a supernatural event, a funny feeling, a mystery, and maybe it left you with a sense of primal fear because you weren't actually sure what is on the other side of that curtain. And so the curtain opens, it closes, and you're left shivering. Now, and again, I think those are moments when God is using those experiences to just say, look at Jesus. Just follow the logic. If there is a God who wants to reveal himself and have a relationship with you, then why not start with like the deepest possible relationship? Jesus. And look at that and consider it and really mull it over. Because I also can guarantee you that Jesus is the only way you get to a God who is a loving Father. You get to see a God who's a loving Father. Stand anywhere else and try to unpack who God is, and you have to include human evil, and so I'm not sure what kind of character you're going to encounter and whether you're going to like it. But I want you to know that what Jesus wants to do is pour his life and his love on us and through us, so that our focus is not simply what is happening to us, but what is happening through us, where we share in Jesus' own experience of the Father's love, and that love becomes not just a thin spot, but an open door, an open gateway where life and love are pouring out and into us and through us. And this is why we firmly say at Neighborhood Church that we want to invite our neighbors to experience this God's overflowing love and justice with us. If you've ever experienced a hint of anything like these, some glimpse of God maybe, I want you to know, or you know other people who have shared things like this, I want you to know the path can lead to Jesus. I think that is genuinely, like, those are signposts. Those are road signs. God is trying to call attention to Jesus. And so, I just want us to spend a few minutes, just talk with one or two other people, and share a story. Like, did anything in my thread of stories make you think, make you look back on something you've experienced? Or maybe have heard someone else experience? That'd be fine too. But we are still on mission, and we are, we have to think about and start organizing some of our thoughts and experiences so that we could share them with others. So let's do that for a few minutes, and then I or Pastor Val will call us back together in a little bit.